So we're going to go through 3 scenarios, again, to just sort of give average levels of assets and income at age 30, age 43, and age 55.
Okay.
And hopefully people will be able to relate to these different scenarios. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. So this first person, Joe Sample,
Okay.
making $70,000 a year, 30 years old, wants to retire at 65, and we're going to assume that he dies at age 90. We're going to keep these 2 numbers constant the entire time, the desired retirement age and the death age, just to keep things consistent.
Gotcha.
Because this person's a little bit younger, we're going to assume they get about, they're going to be slightly more aggressive, let's say. So we're going to assume they get 10% per annum on their investments. Not to overcomplicate things, but we need to keep in mind that when you're saving in a retirement account, say you're putting $6,000 a year into an IRA, you're saving on an annual basis. Every time you put new money in, you're going to lower this percentage because the new monies haven't had time to be invested.
Yeah.
So the reality is you may not get 10%, even if you're, as aggressive as, say, the S&P 500. So just keep that in mind. When you're adding new funds, you lower your return. You're going to have to be probably more aggressive than you're naturally inclined just to make up for the math of the lower percentage return. Okay, but we're going to see 10%. Inflation, I'm going to keep this at a constant at 3.5%. It's worth noting that inflation in the last 2 decades, let's say, it's been around 2%. That is historically very low. Obviously, right now, coming out of the pandemic, we're seeing much higher inflation. Numbers just came out yesterday. I think it was 5.4%. Some of that is temporary, but I think some of it is here to stay. And I think it's going to be safe to assume that inflation is going to be higher going forward than it has in the last 20 years. So let's assume 3.5%. We're going to assume this person wants $90,000 a year pre-tax to fund the lifestyle that they want in retirement. This could be high for some people. It depends on where you live, right? I know many places where you could easily get by on 40 or 50,000. So maybe I'm overshooting it a bit, but this is certainly comfortable for most places in the world. So this person, being 30 years old, retiring at 65, has 35 years to go, and then they've got 25 years of retirement to fund before they die at age 90. Here are their available investments. These are the financial assets. So I'm not talking about, say, your equity in your home, because if you have a home, then that's going to be, eventually paid off, and that would lower your pre-tax retirement needs. But let's just talk about financial assets. So for example, here I've got their retirement accounts, IRA 401k with 30,000 right now as a balance. I'm not going to put the contributions in because that's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, understood.
Then they've got taxable brokerage account.
Okay.
So here they've got 20,000. So they've got 50,000 total. So assuming they put nothing in beyond this, but it grows at 10%, and they've got 35 years to save, they're going to have $1.4 million in 35 years. Let me scroll down. Now, let's assume they get some Social Security. I know that's very a bit of a hot topic. Let's assume we're going to get something. So let's assume we get $1,200 a month or $14,400 a year. This amount here, this is the income that can be generated from 1.4 million if you assume a 3.5% withdrawal rate. So basically it's just 3.5% of 1.4. Now, many people talk about the 4% rule, which is, well, can't I withdraw 4%? Okay, there's a lot of nuance to this. Yes, you can withdraw 4% if you are flexible with your budget, meaning that you're willing to spend less in years when markets are down. If you have that kind of flexibility, 4% is probably sustainable. 4% is sustainable if in the future we get returns anywhere near the returns we've gotten in the last 30, 40 years when these studies were being done. So yes, 4% is probably doable. It also depends on whether you retire into a bull market or a bear market. That's actually very important, because if you retire into a bear market and you start drawing down as the market is, down 30, 40, 50%, well, then you're locking in your losses, and that has a serious impact on how much longer your funds are going to last. So obviously these things are never simple. And even this calculation is a very high level calculation. But I'm just trying to point out the things we need to consider. Let's assume that we can do a 3.5% withdrawal rate just to be safe. So at 3.5% plus Social Security, you're going to earn $64,000 a year, roughly. You're going to be able to spend $64,000 from your assets. However, your cost of living, that $90,000 inflated at 3.5% for 35 years, that's going to be $300,000. That is a big jump. 35 years. So this person has a shortfall of $236,000 basically, right? So what they're going to need at that time. So this is the answer to the question of what's my magic number, if my magic number is sort of like the lump sum I'm going to need at retirement. They're going to need $7.3 million.
Wow.
That's probably a bit of a sticker shock. They're going to have 1.4. So they need another 5.9. So in other words, what do they need to save today? The other part of the magic number, what's their target savings? It's $21,810. And that's 31% of their income. And most people are not putting away 31% of their income.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. It's obviously taking into account a lot of things, which is obviously important. There are things that even if I tried to sit down to work out how much I needed, I wouldn't have come up with anything close to this because I just wouldn't have factored in as many things that you have. And I think inflation's a big one, like, because we just think of inflation as a small number.
Yeah.
But you're right, over a 30-year period, that small number multiplied by 30 compounded is an awful lot.
The two biggest drivers of this model, and by the way, again, this is a very high level model, which is only relevant if the future turns out exactly as we have inputted, right? If we don't get 10%, if inflation is higher or lower, or if you spend more or less, then this is, not very accurate. So this is really very high level ballpark estimate, okay? What counts the most is not even your rate of return or how much you saved, it's your budget, right? If we lowered this to 50,000, this is now 9,500. So that's now less than half of what we were at before.
Probably seems more achievable for probably a lot more people too.
Yeah. Probably the most important factor is how much you're going to need to spend.
The inflation thing is important, right? Because, there's probably some people listening to this thinking, you know what? Yeah, I could live on 50,000 a year. Well, in 35 years time, it's not really 50,000 a year, is it? If you look at the other way, you got to do it in thirds. 50s today probably sounds okay to many people, but in reality, that's like living on 17,000 today.
Look, we don't know what inflation is going to be 20 years or 30 years from now, but I'm saying in the next decade, it's probably going to be higher than it was in the last 20 years. When we run models, I do this all the time. The point of planning is to plan for contingencies. When we plan and we model, we have to be conservative. And being conservative means assuming lower returns, higher inflation, higher cost of living than what we would think. Because one thing we don't know is, am I going to die at age 75 of a heart attack and have no medical expenses? Or will I live to 100 and spend 10 years in like a nursing home? Nobody knows. Well, those are all very important factors. But let me point out one sort of bit of good news, which is that because there are so many unpredictable inputs here, as long as you're willing to be flexible with how you live, you can make the numbers work pretty well. But the problem is we get used to a certain lifestyle and we want the lifestyle in the retirement that maybe we have now, for some of us. And that may or may not be achievable. But flexibility on this number is probably critical.